Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight for this Code Connect, for our second one. Unfortunately for Spanish speakers, we had a technical difficulty. We will not be having translation or interpretation enabled in real time, but instead we are going to have this dubbed after the fact, have this recording dubbed after the fact, and will be presented on the project website.
You want me to do the announcement in Spanish, just in case?
Yes,
Sí,
please.
muy buenas tardes a todos. Qué pena con ustedes, pero por dificultades técnicas no vamos a poder tener la interpretación simultánea hoy. Por lo tanto, vamos a hacer un doblaje del video y se va a montar y compartir más adelante con todos. Y de antemano les pedimos disculpa por cualquier inconveniente. Igual la presentación tiene subtítulos en español, está en español e inglés, por si quieren quedarse y seguirla de igual manera. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so everyone, last time we spoke to you all was in February. So we're excited to have some updates. Since we last spoke, the last time we spoke with you, we had an introduction of the project, a little bit of a context setting to get everyone oriented with what we're planning to do as part of this effort in terms of updating the Unified Development Ordinance, or the UDO. And now we had a chance to sort of take in feedback and content that was received during that engagement process, and some of the open houses and the survey that happened after the fact. We've also presented some new sort of materials in front of the JCCPC. And what we'll be doing tonight, ultimately, is going through some of our takeaways and some of the analysis that we've done that's really targeted. So with that, I want to just set some ground rules for the meeting organization. Like the last Code Connect, we will be having a presentation first, what I will be walking through right now. And if you could please hold questions to the end of the presentation, that would be fantastic. This meeting is being recorded and will be publicly available. And as we mentioned before, due to technical difficulties, we will not be having simultaneous translation or interpretation for Spanish, but we will have a dubbed version in Spanish on the project website. So with that, if you do have any questions that come up during the presentation, please don't be shy to let us know within the project chat, and we'll be able to go through those in the order in which they're received towards the end of the presentation during that Q&A. So again, just a reminder, thanks again for having the answers to your questions completed or responded to at the end of this presentation. Please remain muted if you can until we ask you to unmute yourself to ask a question. If you do have a question or want to ask a question during the Q&A, feel free to click the raise hand tool as well. And at the very beginning, unless we have more free time towards the end, if we could limit one person per question at first, that would be fantastic, just to make sure everybody gets a chance to speak. So just a reminder, why are we doing this effort? So we're updating the Unified Development Code really to achieve 5 different goals, really to enhance organization and usability of the updated document. So really making it easier and clearer to understand, and really trying to simplify processes wherever we can to make development easier and much more straightforward and predictable. We also want to make sure that we're encouraging the right types of housing that happen that are in line with the general plan or the comprehensive plan update. So really making sure that we get more of a mix of housing types in Durham and encouraging the creation of more affordable housing as part of that too. We also want to make sure that we're promoting transit-oriented and pedestrian-friendly development, while also preserving what makes Durham Durham, really preserving that character. Also very important to this effort is making sure that we're increasing open space and tree canopy coverage throughout the city as part of this effort, and promoting more sustainable development across the board for anything that's new that comes in. And very, very important, this is really building off of the comprehensive plan that was just completed. So we are really implementing that vision and making sure that we're adopting all the policies, or as many of the policies that are relevant to zoning within that document. So just to table setting, comprehensive plan, that's just what happened. That's a very high level and visionary plan that guides how and where development occurs in Durham. We are updating the Unified Development Code. Those are the development rules. So that is the implementing tool of the comprehensive plan. And then ultimately, following those tools, new development comes in. So whenever a new development project comes on board, they will be following these new development tools, the new UDO, to ensure compliance. So again, for today's presentation, we are really going to be focusing on three things. The first is really exploring some more options for which small scale residential infill might happen in line with the comprehensive plan's vision. Sort of what is happening today versus how we could change some tools in the future to get your thoughts on it. Same sort of situation in terms of better utilizing land in multifamily areas within Durham, in alignment with the comprehensive plan, and really ensuring that we can promote density around existing and future transit lines as part of that too. So three key elements. So again, we are implementing the new comprehensive plan. It is, as part of that document, there was a series of place types or sort of character areas, for lack of a better word, to implement the land use component and the vision and the look and feel of how development will occur over the future. So this is a very long list, and we wanted to make sure that we are targeting just a few of those place types to really focus our conversation on what we think are the most critical to getting right, and that we think probably the most folks have perspectives and good opinions on. So that is the apartment and townhouse neighborhood place type, the established residential place type, and the transit opportunity area place type. So getting into the established residential, that's that first place type. That's really, it currently is being implemented using the RU5, the RU52, the RS8, the RS10, the RS20, and the RR, rural residential zoning districts. And you can see based on this map, just zoomed in into sort of the core of Durham and sort of the areas outside of the loop, you see that a good portion of the city is covered with this. Ultimately today, that's really functioning mostly as lower intensity residential districts, or really, for lack of a better word, single family existing locations. And at the moment, based on some recent changes that happened to the code a few years ago, you are now able to, what was previously just starting at the RU5 designation for zoning, now allows for something a little bit different called the expanding housing choice option. And basically what that does is within the RU5, the RU52, the RS8, and the RS10, you are now allowed to have a smaller lot size. So that's going down to 2,000 square feet as opposed to something like 5,000 square feet. And in exchange for a smaller building with a smaller height or lower height and a smaller ultimate building size. So that is sort of the trade-off. And you might see a lot of these types of houses sort of showing up or recently built within some of the neighborhoods, particularly closer into the downtown core, the areas right around downtown Durham. From that, you'll notice that sort of from left to right as we scroll through these, that the types of development that you see are all residential, but they all are on larger lots, and it's really gets less and less and less dense over time. So the RU5 and the RU52, that's residential urban, and RS8, residential suburban, those are sort of the next tier out. And again, a lot of the same sort of dimensional standards that you might see across some of these, but one thing that changes substantially is generally the lot size overall. So bigger lot, larger setbacks, that sort of thing. So that's showing it again from the smallest all the way up to the largest with that rural residential. You see again a large lot with lots of big setbacks from streets and from sides and from rears. So what we wanted to do as part of our modeling is understand, sort of take a zoom in a little bit with the HC, or the expanding housing choice development types, and to see, what would happen on different types of RU5 lots. So typical RU5 lots, whether that's on a corner or a mid-block parcel, or within RS10 in a mid-block, to see if we were to potentially remove density requirements, which really functionally are not used today as part of the EHC. It's not really regulated so much. How many of these types of homes could you realistically fit on a lot using most of the same dimensional standards? So if you're not capped with a unit limit, what could you fit? So ultimately, we wanted to see what that would look like from a spatial perspective or just visually, but also understand what the results financially of that would be. And so this is the visual result. So you see that on a corner, ultimately you start to go from 3 units all the way up to about 5 or 6. And what we wanted to do is, sort of get folks' thoughts on how this type of development looks and feels within some of the established residential neighborhoods within the city today, and also examine what the cost of building one of these units or what the selling price for one of these units would look like. So we had one of our team members write some pro formas to effectively, in consultation basically with the local development community, with local folks within the city, folks who have a lot of experience building in Durham, to understand what the real costs were of doing this type of development. And he was able to pretty much let us know, and this is verbatim of, what you see on the left, in the middle, and on the right is consistent with these pro formas, is that generally across the board, no matter really how many units or how many houses you add beyond 3, it's generally hitting about $400,000 for a unit. And that's at the moment hitting pretty much or just slightly below at 98 or 99% AMI or annual median income for Durham. So that is something that works extremely well. And is probably the reason why you're seeing a lot of the expanding housing choice projects being developed throughout the city. It's a very lucrative development type for developers, as well as for folks who are looking to buy an entry-level home in particular. So we also wanted to take a look at how rents would play out under very similar scenarios, same development approach, but what would a rent look like for one of these homes? And unfortunately, just given most of the new construction costs required as part of this, the rents are much too high, and probably would not be a feasible product that a developer or a landlord would want to rent out in Durham. You can see that in most cases, all of these rents basically exceed the annual median income of a typical Durham resident. So probably the reason why you're not seeing a whole lot of rental versions of this product. So what we were really curious to see is sort of transitioning away from more of that traditional single family or lower intensity residential. What would happen if we started exploring multiplex options? And we did that within the RU5 zoning district, because currently, based on the type of street that you're located on, you can in fact work with or add a multiplex onto a property, although it is currently capped at the moment at 8 dwelling units per acre. That's roughly 4 units on a lot, give or take. So we wanted to take a look basically on the left. That's sort of your existing condition. That's sort of what it would take to be able to get 4 units on a lot. So it's a really large lot. It takes, in this case, 21,000 square feet to do that. You have a lot of area that's dedicated for open space, but probably a bit excessive. And we wanted to sort of play around to see what would happen if we actually removed the density maximum for this, to see what types of results we would get. And you can see on this next image that, on a smaller parcel, you're able to fit just as many units. So now you only need just over 10,000 square feet to be able to fit the same amount of units that you would have otherwise been able to do. And from that, we were kind of curious to see what else can we do, or what would it look like if we added even more, if we doubled the density beyond that within sort of a multiplex format. You can see this example on the right. So that's generating on the same lot size, you doubled it effectively. And just for reference across the board here, although Durham does not have minimum parking requirements for these projects or for any development really, we just made a general assumption that there would be 1 parking space provided per unit, just given sort of what the market would be able to provide today. So we were really curious to sort of see what that looks like in terms of rent assumptions of the current condition, right? The current EHC, working with 2 duplexes on a pretty large lot. We're still really exceeding the annual median income by quite a bit. So again, not terribly feasible from a new construction perspective, unless it was an old home that already existed and it was really easy to convert that into rentals. The new construction costs just make it really unfeasible. So again, you can look at sort of at that next level intensity, adding the 2 duplexes on a lot that's about half the size, starts to get a little bit better into range. We're almost at annual median income for Durham, but not great either. Could get better. So then when we doubled it again, now we're starting to go below the annual median income. So all of a sudden, if someone were to have to rent these out, someone could rent one of these units for a much more affordable price. and it goes down substantially. So some other things we wanted to explore as part of this to see if we could lower that rent even further to make it more attainable for these types of products was, smaller unit sizes. So in most of the examples that we looked at before, in the three that you see, we were assuming something at around 1,000 square feet per unit. And when we decrease that size down to 800 square feet, we actually reduce quite a bit. So it goes down to about 80% of the annual median income. And then again, it starts to go down a little bit further as we reduce parking. Not a huge difference, but it does help. And then if you're, again, able to add more units, add an additional duplex, for example, 2 more units onto that lot, you really start to see some differences. So it's an 800 square foot unit and it goes down quite a bit. So sort of interesting lesson learned for us is that the more units that we can fit on a typical parcel in sort of a small house scale building type, the more affordable we can make those units or those rents particularly. So the next tier up that we looked at was the apartment and townhouse neighborhood place type from the comprehensive plan. And today, really, it's the RSN, RUM, and the RC districts that are currently implementing that for the most part. So we wanted to test out to see what is currently allowed on a site like this. So we sort of assumed generally similar lot size across the board, so we could try to compare apples to apples. And ultimately, under the current rules, you'll notice that mostly because of density limits that are in place today, you really can't do, although you might have a lot of dimensional standards or a lot of room that you could build with, that even maybe dimensional standards would let you do. If you were sort of assuming normal unit sizes that would be marketable in Durham, you wouldn't be able to use up the whole lot to really achieve that. So you can really see it the most drastically with the RSM, the residential suburban district. You would really realistically only use the small piece of the lot, as opposed to, on the other end of the spectrum, now it starts to fill out a little bit more. This is the residential compact. So looking at if we just remove density and just to see what would happen to those lots, if we assume the same dimensional standards, all of a sudden, basically what is told to us, right? So the idea that 3 stories versus 4 stories versus 6 stories, all of a sudden the building envelope that you would get under the current rules starts to get filled out once you remove that density limitation. So just something to explore. We'd be really curious to get folks' thoughts on these, and if this is something that folks are interested in seeing in strategic locations as we start thinking about generating zoning districts. So the last option is the most intense. This is the transit opportunity areas. This is really currently the CD and CSD districts. It doesn't take up much of Durham's land area at the moment, so it's only about 5%, but it does, pack a big punch in terms of how many units it can provide to the community. So we looked at those 2 districts in particular, did a similar exercise as we did for the last version with those apartments and townhome neighborhoods, and wanted to see what the current rules get you from a density perspective, and then what would happen if we remove the density requirement. So currently under the current rules, really you're not going to max out the lot much. You might hit the maximum floor count, but the site's not going to be utilized in a really compact way. So given that this is an area that is intended to be much more intense and to receive a lot more units based on the comprehensive plan, we wanted to see if we removed that density limit, what happens. So sort of using our best guess in terms of what the market would realistically deliver and trying to do better streetscape conditions and things like that, all of a sudden we start to get these types of designs. So this is basically looking explicitly at the compact design core and then sort of moving up what could you realistically achieve, and it's much higher. So ultimately, as we came away from these different modeling exercises, we wanted to understand and think through sort of 4 different types of next steps in our minds. And so some of these things are based on they're more like structural to the document that we presented at previous presentations, but we decided to not speak about during today's presentation, just because we wanted to dedicate most of our discussion to the look and feel and modeling and development. But ultimately, we were thinking it might make a lot of sense to actually combine some of these lower intensity residential districts, which now, based on some of the more recent changes to the UDO, really are doing many of the same things or getting to the same results. So simplifying those down maybe to, residential neighborhood and then residential rural perhaps could be an interesting and more straightforward way of understanding some of these zoning districts. The other thing that we were considering is to, just based on the exercises that we were doing, is to allow more units on existing lower intensity residential lots. So maybe in this case, should we think about just allowing more than 4 units per lot on all RU5 lots? Is that a good starting point? I'd love to hear your thoughts. And then from a broader perspective, again, sort of thinking of the structure and the naming convention of these zoning districts, we wanted to see if it makes sense maybe to try to consolidate what would be within sort of particularly within the transit-oriented areas, to break down what is ultimately mostly just mixed use in both scenarios, but really just change it based on what is the emphasis of that building type. So commercial emphasis and mixed use development as opposed to residential emphasis mixed use, and trying to structure those maybe by the maximum floor height. So you would read this and say, okay, it's a mixed use, commercial heavy, it's only 3 stories. Okay, and then you can sort of read through that consistently for all of these. And then ultimately, as part of going back to sort of that second summary is, should we consider removing units per acre just as a density metric generally as part of this effort? And maybe just use a combination of lot and form standards to control that. So really focusing more on the building form and caring a little bit less about the amount of units that you can fit within that form. So we'd love to get your thoughts on this. We presented these same ideas to JCC-PC, and they ultimately responded pretty well to this, but the main takeaways were that they wanted really to emphasize the concentration of density within the urban growth boundary. So building up, not out. They were pretty clear about that. Streamlining and consolidating zoning districts. So supportive of sort of that simplification of the naming convention that we just talked about, and aligning the zoning districts with the comprehensive plan place types. So whether that's from just making sure that they are geographic, or even considering doing that from a name perspective, a naming convention perspective. So maybe that's something that we can explore. So we're going to take a look at that as part of our next steps. And again, they were really excited and proponents of placing a greater emphasis on form, so the built outcomes, and less on density as a metric to control development. So we'd love to get your thoughts on that too. Do you disagree with their takeaways? Are you on board with that? Let's discuss it. So just in terms of next steps, we are just about to start May, or just about to start June. So we're just wrapped up our code audit approach, and we're about to jump into our code drafting. So you can expect to see us again for our 3rd Code Connect in July. And at that point, we're planning to walk through some of our draft zoning districts and maybe geographically a map of what those look like. So we're pretty excited about that. And we're really excited to hear your feedback on what you have to say to all this stuff. So again, just a reminder, if you have any questions and comments, I've already seen there's a good list of questions and comments in the chat. We'll go through that. I'll have Bahisi sort of walk through those in order. And yes, just to repeat again, if you could, we'll be answering those questions in the order they're received, and we'll be, and continue to keep yourself muted until we answer, or we call on you. So with that, Bahisi, did you want to walk through some of the questions that you see in the chat?
Yes, absolutely. And before I jump into any of the substantive questions, Mimi had a question about where she can find a recording of this meeting.
That's a great question. So you will be able to find a recording of this meeting at our project website, engagedurham.com/new UDO. And you will find it within one of the drop-down menus. So and you can find even the Code Connect before that. That's all available online as well.
Thanks, Max. Mimi also had a question regarding the RU5 models. She was curious to know, she wants to clarify the heights of the RU5 models.
Sorry, could you ask that question one more time?
The heights of the RU
Yes.
models, if we can
Yes.
clarify the exact height.
Let's see, for the RU5s, currently those are 3 stories if you're not doing HC, but let's see. But you're capped at 2 stories or 32 feet. So it's basically 3 stories or 40 stories maximum in RU5 under a single family typical condition. And if you opt into the expanding housing choice option, that height goes down.
Great. Thanks, Max.
Yeah.
The other question that we have in the chat is from Eliza. And the question is, can you go deeper into the pro forma and what you mean by very lucrative for developers? What is the typical return on investment or ROI for this type of investment?
So let's see. Let me go to that. So we're going to look purely at the performance for the RU5 and the RS10. So exploring those expanding housing choice options. And so basically what we meant by why this is so feasible is generally at the rate in which you can develop these things for sale purposes, it's going to be at the annual median income for most home buyers in Durham, or the annual median income. But ultimately, I think off the top of your head, I think most of these are always hitting generally between 15 and 23% project rate of return on cost, which is why it's pretty.
Yeah, lucrative was probably the wrong word.
It
just means these are financially feasible from a developer's perspective, that the ROI on this development pattern makes sense from a developer's perspective.
Thanks, Colin. Yeah, generally anything below 15% is not something that a developer would pursue.
Great. Thanks, Max. Before we jump back into the chat, I see that JQ, you have your hand up.
Yes, I do. This is a little bit out of left field, but it seems like, one of our priorities is trying to make things more affordable. And I think, some of these changes are trying to head in that direction, but it seems like even at the absolute densest, the percentage of AMI is only going down to maybe like 75%. And I think, so if that's like, 75% of the halfway point, that means that probably like, I think like 37% of Durham is still not going to be able to afford any of this. Is there things that we can be doing in the UDO that's kind of addressing the, other 37% of Durham that's not able to live in these? And I know like creating more units, the idea is that will help. Is there any sense of trying to allow more non-traditional forms of housing, like allowing people to live out of an RV on their land or on a neighbor's land, or something that's a little bit outside the box? Because it seems like with all these changes that we're doing, we're just not able to get that affordability that I think all of us are looking for.
Absolutely, that's a great question. And yeah, you're absolutely right. So I think to answer your question, there are tools that we have in terms of basically the simplest tool, or the tool that gets used pretty often and something that Durham already uses but might need to be calibrated a bit differently, is the affordable housing bonus. So basically limiting how much you can do by right, without providing any affordable housing. And if you provide a certain percentage of affordable housing units, the height and the number of stories that you can go up to increases. So, and that would be, those units would be basically required to be hit a certain AMI percentage. And it could be tailored to that lower, that 30% that you're asking about. So that's one way, but I'm really glad you brought up sort of the idea of things like more non-traditional housing options. Something that Portland, Oregon did recently is basically allow for just that. So in addition to allowing for things like, I think that they might allow for maybe 2 accessory dwelling units within an existing single family home, and also allow you to basically park an RV within your lot as long as you've got like an RV hookup, that's perfectly fine. So that's
guess
also a great way to do it as well, but it's
we
not.
we just
Go
have to
ahead,
make
Colin.
sure that that works with the building code. I guess that would be my only concern, is that the safety folks want to make sure that everything associated with that RV being there permanently was safe as it should be, especially from a fire perspective.
Yeah, I would also, we've got a minimum housing code in Durham that we would need to make sure it complies, because I don't think as currently
Mhm.
written it would for permanent housing. Mimi also asked about a manufactured home. And I will say that I think that's something that will definitely be looked at, right? Is where we allow manufactured homes and where we don't, and if that's appropriate, or are we making it difficult for a manufactured home? That being said, we do, modular homes are treated just the same as stick built,
Yep.
and that's one more affordable option that we have seen in parts of the county.
Yeah, my understanding with manufactured homes is you have to allow a manufactured home in anywhere that you allow a single family home, if it's being certified by HUD, which is, I think, basically any manufactured home after, I think it's like 1976. I
76 or 79, one of the
Something
two.
like that.
I get them mixed up.
But you're not, from a fair housing perspective, you're not supposed to discriminate against manufactured housing.
Great. It looks like Ajax, you have your hand up. Sorry if I mispronounced your name.
No, you're good. It's Ajax. Thanks a lot. So can we talk a little bit about some examples, or maybe walk us through your thinking as we're moving toward more of a form-based code, and removing density limits? How will intensity be introduced into that new regime in a way that I guess balances, maximizing the usable, buildable land with the community's interest and or perception about change and
Yeah.
how it takes place. What does that actually look like?
Well, if you want to flick to some of those slides, Max, where we show
the
some of that
difference.
modeling, it's clearly a balancing act. But I mean, really, what we're suggesting is that the density constraints right now may not be getting the community the right type of intensity development, I guess, in certain places across the community in order to meet their comprehensive planning objectives. So I guess what we're suggesting is removing density and regulating the basic elements of form. So height, so you would set, maximum height and stories that you're comfortable with. And then, whether parking's required or not, I think it's still going to be a huge constraint, right? In terms of I don't think Durham's there where you're going to be able to build too many buildings, if any, without any parking requirements. So we were assuming a space per unit when we put these models together. But there are other components like, building coverage that we can regulate that would restrict the overall bulk of a building. We also do typically regulate the maximum width of a building, depending on what zoning district it is and what setting it's in. So we're really just focused on controlling the physical aspects of a project and not focusing on about how many specific people might be living in that project moving forward.
And also something that we find to be pretty helpful about that is in many ways, the way that zoning codes are, when we have a density cap like that, ultimately what it ends up incentivizing in most cases is larger units as opposed to more affordable smaller units. So that's like where the unfortunate example of that is like when you start seeing like McMantification of single family homes where you might instead see someone retain an existing house and then say, okay, well, maybe I'll just add another house back behind it and subdivide it out or something, and make a new entry level home and retain that other home. So you start to get more diversity of housing units within a neighborhood. Someone would just get rid of that house and say, well, I could sell it for more if I just doubled it and built it out as big as I can based on the current standards. And so we're trying to provide some other options.
Do we have any other questions from the public, either in the chat? Oh, it looks like we have a question from Diana. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Thank you. I was wondering if there's been any studies on the impact of the infrastructure on the high density residential compact plans, like all the, how high you can go, how many people can live there, and what impact will that have on the current infrastructure regarding water, waste distribution, and other safety features that someone has already mentioned, and like fire safety and all that stuff. But what about the water and sewer system? That's kind of old right now anyway. I mean, who's going to upgrade that stuff so that it can accommodate? Because you really can't live well without good water. I'm just saying, I know there's concerns about that. So is there any study on the impact of water use on the infrastructures?
We haven't done anything specifically as part of this project, any kind of specific study or anything.
Okay.
But ultimately, when it comes to the fire safety question that you had, that's any new development that would come online would have to follow the fire code, and that's typically, much like parking, is more important from what the result is and what the impact of a design can look like. Is we found in many places that fire codes determine many of the housing types you get. But yeah, that is the last thing, shockingly, that I would be worried about. It's the fire code. They're pretty good about that.
Okay, great. We'll hand the mic to Mimi.
Hi. This is really a very interesting presentation, and I understand it a lot better than when I was watching the presentation to the JCCPC. Could you go back to the transportation zone slide? Excuse me. So what I'm curious about is whether the comprehensive plan encourages any kind of taller residential buildings in these areas. Do you know?
Yes, it does. And so that's in many cases what we were trying to explore. So in these scenarios, for example, here, we didn't necessarily, this is showing 4 stories. That's not suggesting that that's what that you're capped at that. It's saying that that's all you can really get with the density limit that you've got, versus down here. I don't think that we're even, maybe for the CDC, we've actually hit the height maximum, but Bo might have to correct me on that.
Of 12 stories?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think you have.
Okay.
And,
so yeah,
wait, so
please,
how tall is the one across from the old bank building, one city center or something? How tall is that one?
I believe 27 stories. I don't have the measurement offhand.
And did they have to get some sort of a that they built that before I came back to Durham? How did they have to get a permission to go that tall? Or was that by right?
That was by right.
Okay, so because it was a downtown area,
district,
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So they tell me that only 5 stories can be built with wood, and beyond that, it has to be steel or something.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering whether in a transportation, so according to this, in a transportation zone, you could only get as many as 12 stories for an apartment building. Is that true?
It depends currently on the underlying district. So if, as Bo had mentioned, in downtown, you can go higher than that. I think we were only exploring sort of the little ring of core districts that sort of line downtown. So
Yeah.
this isn't even showing the most intense that you could go, but
Oh, it isn't. Okay.
no.
Well, it is outside of downtown.
Yes, thank you.
I don't
Okay.
think anybody's talking about 27-story buildings outside of downtown. I could be wrong,
Mhm.
Bo, but I don't think the plan envisions that kind of intensity anywhere else but downtown.
Mhm.
Yeah, I've
Um,
never heard of it.
I think that the tallest that you can go, and this is a continuing changing thing, but I think you can do 2 stories of a concrete podium and then 5 stories of kind of stick-built wood construction on top of that. So you can go to kind of 7 stories, which is kind of like the sweet spot, I think, before you have to change building code and you go into the high-rise building code. And so from our understanding, you have to get something like 12, 13, 14 stories once you switch into that high-rise building code just to make your project pencil out. Because going to 8 stories using the high-rise building code doesn't typically pencil out.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for asking.
Great. We have, going back to the chat, we have a request from Pamela regarding the fire code. Is anybody able to respond to that inquiry?
What about the fire code in particular?
She's just asking if somebody can share the fire code with her. Just wanted to flag that for the team.
Can you send out the fire code?
Are we able to share a link, I guess, would be the...
Yeah.
Is that the request within the chat?
Yeah, that's a request in the chat.
Okay.
They're not that shareable, are they, typically, Max? The building code and the fire code?
Unfortunately, that's like you have to pay for certain
Sometimes.
access, but it's depends on what you're trying to look for.
Yeah, I would, Pam, I'll reach out to the folks with city and county that enforce and see, but my understanding is there's not a free document that can just be handed over easily.
And if you think the zoning code or the UDO is tough to read, jump into the building code or fire code and you'll be thoroughly confused.
Well, we have another question from Donna. So Donna asks, have there been any studies on what geology will support in Triassic soil? Newer and taller buildings are sinking in China. So what any geological studies on the soil that would support some of these taller buildings?
No, that's a great question, and I would actually not be terribly concerned about that. There are lots, speaking of complicated codes, high-rise code is very, very detailed about how foundations need to be for tall rise or high rises and stuff. And generally we found that even in places that don't have great soil in the US, those buildings are remarkably good at doing their jobs and can withstand some pretty wild things that most of our smaller scale buildings just can't do because they're just required. The infrastructure required to build them is really high. But we don't regulate that. We don't regulate the foundations. That's also building code.
It is an interesting fact. So thank you for bringing that up. And
yeah,
I guess we'll look into that a little bit. So I'm kind of interested in it. So thanks, Donna.
Great. So that's I don't see any other questions in the chat. Any other questions from the public? Okay, it looks like Ajax. has another question, feel free.
This is my second question. Are you sure you're ready to move on?
We're all
Yeah.
up to 2s and 3s. It's fine. As long as we got the first right.
Will you all be considering NC HFA requirements for LIHTC projects at all in as a lens or in the way you draft the elements of the form-based code that would tend to apply, you know, for example, in the transit opportunity areas? You know, we don't, I guess. So I was on listening in last night to the discussion around the Walltown redevelopment of Northgate Mall project, and you know they have a very high scoring project that's likely to be competitive for a 9% tax credit, and that's great. And if they get it in a given year, likely someone else in Durham won't. And so there are already a lot of barriers, or a lot of hurdles, I would say, for affordable housing developers doing LIHTC development just to meet the rather stringent requirements of getting those deals done. And so will you all be able to, I guess, contemplate the ways in which a form-based code can not make it harder than it already is, especially in the zones where what we really need to see is, if we're going to take the cap off on density, what we really need to see there is mixed income affordable housing development that's likely to be funded through 4% and 9% tax credit deals.
That's a great question. And we can absolutely take a look at that as part of this. It's not something that we've taken a deep dive at just yet. Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, Max, sorry to cut you off. That is something that we've focused on and recognized as an issue, and we've made some changes to the existing Unified Development Ordinance in terms of recognizing that tax credit projects oftentimes need an individual parcel or can't be, or subsequently can't be dispersed throughout a particular development. And so we've tried to remove some of those barriers or hindrances, I guess, within the code, because we had some fairly well-intentioned requirements in there with density bonus and other affordable incentives, and we've kind of tried to accommodate, recognizing some of the issues that you brought up.
Okay, so we just got a question from Eliza. The question is somewhat not related to the presentation, but is the team looking into the traffic studies that have been triggered by that get triggered by new development, and how can we have a better model around that? One that perhaps allows larger developers to support local infrastructure needs. Eliza has heard about other areas that do a payback process for developers that triggers it after the initial developer comes in and completes the project. So I think the question is related to transportation impact analyses and potentially impact fees, but I'll hand it over to the team to respond.
Do you want to tackle that one, Bill?
Well, the question is somewhat unclear to me. I will say that we currently have impact fees for transportation. They are in the ordinance. In terms of the specifics and the science behind it, that goes to a study that was done some years ago, I believe 2007, so fairly long ago. So I probably have to defer to the transportation department on some of that. Or you're talking about a fee in lieu for the improvements. I can't actually tell based on the term payback. So if you want to,
Eliza has her hand up. Eliza, feel free
yeah,
to.
Eliza, clarify, please.
Hey, sorry, y'all. I'm trying to do some gardening and listen. Thanks for bearing with me. So from what I understand, there's the TIA, traffic impact, and if a development is large enough, it triggers that, and then that developer is required to do some larger infrastructure improvements, right? And so I think on the developer side, there may be several larger parcels that developers across different developers are looking to develop. And they all kind of are playing like chicken and egg with who's going to go first.
Yep.
And in other areas, what I've heard is they have a setup different than ours, where it's not a first come, you do it, and the next person doesn't have to do it. Instead, like the second person would pay back their portion to the first. And so you, instead of this like backdoor thing that happens amongst developers, it kind of like eliminates that issue. And so I was just curious if that is being considered as a part of the UDO changes, if that even would fall into the UDO. It just feels like something that other cities have figured out, and was curious if we're talking about that here in Durham.
Yeah, I do think that's something that will be discussed as it relates to, you know, fee and lieu options and other things. I think the sort of reimbursement type situations, we've participated in those with other projects when the city's participating in their particular project. But in terms of the developers, we have not done that. That does sound like something we need to look into.
Yeah, we're happy to take a look at it. And if you have any recommendations of communities that you think are doing a better job at this, we'd be interested in going to look at those.
Great, Mimi, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
I have two questions, and they're related to the comparison I'm making in my mind to what you presented to the JCCPC and what you're presenting now. One of them is you said that you were going to structure the code differently than it's currently structured. And you know, if it has to do with like parking, you don't have to read 10 different sections to find out what parking is, you know, and I think that's a fantastic idea. And at the conclusion of that meeting, there was something that was said about that, you know, were they okay with going ahead and saying that there could be, you know, 8 dwelling units on a lot across the entire city? And that if that is an accurate representation, I don't really understand it, because I looked at your modeling and I didn't see that that was the case.
I think my understanding, and please, Bo or Colin, correct me if I've got this wrong, but was that ultimately, I want to say that Sarah had sort of mentioned, like, are you okay with basically the city doing more of its fair share if you're within the urban growth boundary?
Yes.
It's not just going to be that we're going to target, you know, all this density and, you know, basically the transit-oriented areas and the corridors, and that's it. Everybody else stays exact. It's going to be basically exactly the same. And I think the question was, are you comfortable seeing basically more of less of an extreme, right? Where you might see that added capacity in those particular areas that we described, but also as an infill product for within those residential. I don't know if 8 units came up though.
I mean,
8 units
did
was
ask that
specifically.
question. We asked that question. And so I think what we were suggesting to the JCCPC was we were trying to help them understand the implications of what it might look like financially from 4 units to 6 units to 8 units. And we were kind of
to the developer.
Yes. And the community as a whole. And just kind of asking them that question, like, where on that spectrum do you think Durham should be? And they didn't really necessarily answer that question specifically. And so I think we got to do a little bit more thinking about it, but I think they did encourage us to kind of think that way in terms of trying to think of ways to put more and different types of housing units into some of the city and county neighborhoods.
So what was said about the 8 units, and I thought that what was being said was that there were going to be the same opportunities across all of inside the urban boundary. And so now you're telling me that isn't true. Is that correct?
Can't recall off the top of my head, but I would have to take a double check, I think, of what was said during that meeting, but I don't think it was necessarily, I could be wrong. Yeah, I don't want to disregard what you said. I don't remember.
So on an average lot in Durham, that's 50 feet wide and 100 feet deep, you can now have as many as 6 dwelling units on that space. And so our concern was, are we now saying that you can have 8?
I see. And that was really thinking through the expanding housing choice option.
Yes.
Which
exactly.
ultimately, I see. Okay. Yes, that indeed was a question. I think in terms of like expanding that type of the ability to be able to do that as sort of the
By
expanding
right.
housing choice.
Maybe
Yes.
may I just clarify a little bit? Every lot is a little bit different. You know, I start with a 50 by 150 being very standard in most neighborhoods, and there's a chunk of 75 150s, and that's a lot of what was looked at as a part of their analysis. But if you had the 50 by 100 that you referenced, the only way you're getting 3 is with the use of accessory dwelling units.
Yes, right. You can have a duplex, and you can have 2 duplexes and 2 accessory dwelling units.
Yes, and I just was just throwing that distinction out for folks.
Mhm.
The accessory dwelling versus, you know, you couldn't have 6 separate lots. Based on the map. That was it.
So there's a tipping point between what you said at the beginning about the comprehensive plan and how we want for Durham to stay like Durham, yeah, go back to that slide. That'd be great.
Let's see. Almost there. Here we go.
Yeah. So I'm not sure how to express this. I really don't think that the majority of the people in Durham wants Durham to be completely exploding with housing. We'd like for the housing to be more being more intense in terms of the number of people is fine, but having apartment buildings built in a residential area that is all single family homes would be shocking. It's not that may be good in certain areas, but I think that we don't want to end up like Austin. And you know, San Francisco and various other places that have not curtailed development. You know, that they've allowed a lot more to be developed, and it's changed the fundamental character of the city.
I think we hear you. It's a, you know, a balancing act, and so
exactly.
I think what the JCCPC has encouraged us to do is to think a little bit about that balance, and help them understand the implications on the cost of housing. So, you know, we're going to be continuing that conversation with you and the community and the elected officials, and, you know, bring some suggested zoning changes forward for people to look at.
Okay, so there are a lot of people who are alarmed about this whole thing about the 8 units per lot. And so now I can tell them that that wasn't the agreement that you heard?
No,
Okay,
no.
all right, good. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for asking.
Thanks, guys. So we're past 7, but I do want to flag a link that Bo shared in the chat. It's a free link to the codes referenced earlier in the chat, just for everyone's reference, in case you want to copy and paste that link before the end of this meeting. Max, can I hand over the platform back to you?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Behezi.
Wow.
So yeah, thank you all very, very much for joining our presentation today. This was really great feedback and really good discussion. I'm really excited to meet and discuss with you all again about sort of the new districts that come out, part of this effort in July. So do stay tuned about that. And again, our apologies about the Spanish interpretation. You will see a dubbed version of this presentation on the website as well. Do you want to close out, Bo?
Yeah, I was just going to thank everybody for coming and look forward to continuing to do these and continue to work. And I know we've got the email address and the website up here, but I really want to encourage folks to engage. And as you have thoughts and questions, don't feel that you need to wait for a particular moment or instruction. Please send emails or give me a call. I'm super interested in having these conversations. It's what we're here for. And
Thank you very much for doing this. It was a very good presentation.
thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
See you all in July.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.